If you're ready to harness the power of your communications data, blast off with Nylas today.
Hey, Blag, happy Friday.
Hey, Ash, happy Friday to you too.
And happy 30th stream as well. I don't think I realized that was the case until you just happened to mention it right before we went on.
Yeah, it's been so fast. I mean, 30 episodes, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, and on this live stream, we've covered just tons of stuff. You're going through different programming paradigms right now, which has been really interesting. We have another one coming up next week. Of course, we talk lots about like cool things that you can do with Nylas APIs, with email and calendar and contacts. But we've gotten to cover a lot of really interesting stuff over these 30 episodes. So let's today's going to be a little interesting because this is actually the first time I'm going to be driving and showing something off in code. Usually it's the other way around. I get to kind of watch you and ask questions and learn about things that you're working on. Today, this is something that's been on my mind for a long time. I want to show off how we can get the Notion and Nylas APIs to work very nicely together. So why don't we jump right into it? I'll go ahead and share my screen, and we can kind of talk through a little bit of like, why would we want to do that in the first place?
Let's see.
Okay, here we go. So this is Notion. In Nylas DevRel in developer relations, we use Notion constantly for all kinds of different things. Related to planning our content or working on different initiatives like Hacktoberfest, and just all kinds of stuff around the board. So there's lots of different things that you can do with Notion, but the core concept, of course, is that everything you have is more or less a database, which means that you've got just like insane flexibility with what you can do with it. And that flexibility has only recently gotten more interesting because now there's an API that developers can play with on top of it. But just kind of looking for the user perspective for just a second. Here, we've got like what you might call like a Kanban board or a status board for tasks and issues. And this is a sample board that the Notion team makes available to people who want to kind of play around with the API. But just kind of walk through it real quick. These are just like tasks and issues. Could be anything. But in this case, you'll see here, we've got all these statuses in the different columns. Things probably start out with no status. But when you're getting closer to getting ready to work or launch on something, you'd move it into next up. And then once you're actually like hands-on getting it done, you move the item into the no progress column. And then, of course, ultimately, when you're done with it and you've shipped it, it's into the completed column. Pretty basic idea of what a Kanban board can look like. But we're going to use this as kind of the springboard for what we do here with both the Notion and Nylas APIs today. So specifically, what we want to get to is the idea that, let's say, for example, like, okay, I'm going to move fixed keyboard shortcuts into in progress. So if I do that, if you come in and check in the board, then you'll see that that's been updated, and probably if you're tagged on it, you would get a notification up here in Notion that I've had some kind of activity on here. But what if you're not checking into Notion on a regular basis, or maybe what if you're not tagged, but you do want to kind of keep up to date on some of the things that are going on, and there's a number of different ways you might accomplish that task. But of course, one of them is like, maybe you just want to get updates in email. So that's what we're going to talk about here, is how would we take this Kanban board and make sure that when there's an update, that if I want it as a user, I can basically, be subscribed to getting granular updates on all of the things that are happening in this board. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. That's pretty cool.
Okay, awesome. So, of course, the solution here is going to be, well, it's Notion, so we need to use the Notion API to get that information. And then next up, we need to, use the Nylas API. If we have something that we, information that we're like, hey, this is interesting based on whatever our application considers to be interesting, then we're going to use that Nylas email API to send an email to the user. So let's dig in. And I want to dig in actually first by just kind of talking about a little, showing off a little bit of the system design that we're going to use. So I'll pull over my browser here. We'll just kind of talk about it. So I think maybe if we just draw it, it might be a little easier to sort of get a handle on. So here we go. This is going to be our application server right here. This is sort of the middle of everything. I, as a developer, a third-party developer or a customer of these two companies, I'm building an integration, and my app sits here, and it's going to kind of like be in the middle of all things. So, okay. First up, our app needs to know what's going on in Notion. So we're going to add a node over here, and this is going to be our Notion. And specifically, we'll be looking, your application will most likely be subscribed to a specific database inside of Notion. So, and we'll have a look at what that looks like in the code in just a minute, but we'll just call it Notion here. Okay, great. So that means that your application server needs to know when something changed in Notion. So the Notion team and their API team, looking at their roadmap, it appears that they're working on webhooks, but they're not quite there yet. So, in a world where if you had webhooks available to you, then actually your application server could just set up an endpoint and say, okay, Notion, I'm not going to call you. You call me when something of interest has changed. And so we would just have like a single arrow going this way. But with the Notion API, we're not quite at a stage where that option is available to us. So instead, we'll be doing something called polling, which is we're going to reach out on a regular basis and ask Notion for the latest status of something. So we'll just call this like the latest. And it's a question mark because it's going to be like, hey, can you give me the latest on a particular database that we're subscribed to? And then, of course, Notion's going to give us that back. Here's the latest. Cool. So now our application server is getting that back, but on its own, the latest information doesn't mean much because we don't have anything to compare it to. How would we know if something had changed? Yeah. So what we're going to do is essentially have a database, and in our example, we'll just be using a plain old JavaScript object to store our data. But you can, of course, just imagine that this would be a database. So we'll just put a database here. And that's a history of the changes on the Notion database that we're subscribed to. And so the question here is basically this. Our application server needs to answer this question after it has all of this data available to it, which is this. Are there changes in the latest compared to the previous version? So in other words, we're going to fetch the latest, and then the first time around store it in the database, and then maybe a user comes in and they've made some changes. Well, when we fetch the latest again, what we get back from Notion is going to be different than that first copy. And since the first copy is also, not a copy of the database, but like, the specific sort of data that we're interested in tracking over time is all kept in our database here. So we can just compare what we just got now to what we just got a moment ago. And most of the time, that's probably not going to be, there may be nothing. And so that's where the flow stops because, of course, hopefully your team's not in there in your Kanban board, just like moving things around all over the place all of the time. Maybe they are, but hopefully they're not. Only it's when they have like important changes to note. So here's the thing. If we do find a change, though, now we need to work on, okay, here's the user's email inbox, right? So, okay, we want to let the user know that these changes happened via email. So we're gonna kind of like prepare an email on the app server side. We need to get it into their inbox. So there are a number of different ways one could go about doing this, but the easiest, of course, would be working with Nylas to make it super simple to send those changes. So we'll take the changes here and we'll have a look at what that actually looks like in the code in just a moment. But we're going to use the Nylas APIs to send those changes and ultimately have them delivered to the user's email inbox. So that's our system design. Again, like the main way that we stay updated with Notion is through a polling mechanism. So we'll keep reaching out a little bit over time. will track those changes over time in the database. And anytime we notice a change compared to the previous state, then we're going to say, hey, Nylas, I want to send this email to this user, and those changes are going to land in the email inbox. So any questions on that?
Yeah, that's going to be on a particular Kanban board. I mean, it's not like anything that you do in Notion is going to be emailed, right?
That's right. It's up to what you're subscribed to, and I'll actually walk us through exactly what I mean when I say that. So kind of depends on what your application wants to do, but by default, no, you're not getting anything. You actually have to set this up to let Notion know specifically what database you're interested in talking to, and not only that, but then you would need to share your integration. Share your database in Notion with the integration, with the app server that you're building. So it's kind of like this two-way streak. The app server will say, hey, this is the database I want to talk to. And then you would go into Notion and say, okay, this is the application server or the application that I want to open up my database to. Okay. So you kind of have to have people, you need to kind of like approve it on both sides, if you will.
Yeah.
So cool. Let's jump into then. We'll talk a little bit. This is our basic system design, and now we're going to go in and kind of talk a little bit about the code and what we're going to be working on. So just high level, we're going to be building a Node.js script. One other thing, in the browser that I want to point out is that standing on the shoulders of giants here, because if you go to developers.notion.com. One of their examples is exactly send an email from a Notion trigger. So they're using a different provider in this case, or a different API to send those emails. So we're going to take this sample and show how we can use the sample, but instead leverage Nylas. Big thanks, of course, to Aman Gupta, whose work we're piggybacking on here to show a really cool example. And so let's get into it. We're going to have a look at the code base here. I'll just slide this over. You can see I've got VS Code open. And before we dig into the code specifics, I want to open up package.json. So our dependencies here are obviously Node.js. And then we'll be using the Notion client, which is their SDK. We're using Nylas, the Nylas Node SDK. And then we're using .env. And of course, .env, if you watch this live stream at all, we talk about it a lot because it's a good way to make sure that you can put your most sensitive credentials in a file that then are not stored in version control, but also makes it quite live stream friendly. So if you have a look here in the code, and we'll walk through some of the specifics here in a second, but anytime you see process.env and then these all cap sort of constants like Notion key or Nylas client ID and the like, those are all coming from .env. So we just make this one call, it reads into process.env, all of anything that we have stored in our .env file. Okay, so those are all of our dependencies. We talked a little bit about the credentials. We won't really have a look at like where to go to get your credentials, but certainly you're going to need when you set up the Notion client, you're just going to instantiate a new client, and you're going to pass in your Notion key here, and that's something that you can go in and set up at developers.notion.com. And similarly for Nylas, you're going to need to do kind of the same kind of thing. You're going to configure the SDK, the Nylas SDK with a client ID and secret that you would get at developer with no s .nylas.com. And then from there, you're also going to pass in with this Nylas.with call, you're going to pass in an access token. And that access token is basically saying like, I have already gone in and connected my email account to this integration. And this is my user's access token. So these are your application credentials here, and then your user's access token here. So one other thing I'll point out is just some basic setup. And this isn't really sensitive data, so I'll actually show it here, which is just Notion database ID. We just talked about it a second ago, how both your application and the database need to agree that there should be a connection in Notion's API. So what we're going to do is I'll show you where you would get that Notion database ID. There's a couple of ways to do it. One, you can just like go into this the ellipsis menu and do copy link. Another fast way to do it is to just do Command L I love Command L because I'm always sending people links to things in Notion, so it's a super handy shortcut to remember. But either way, you're going to end up with this. And just sort of the basic taxonomy of these Notion URLs, as I understand them, is here you see this query parameter, v equals, and then you get another sort of unique ID. That v apparently stands for view. In this situation, we won't need that. That's not important here. Instead, we're looking for the database ID, and that's this little thing here, this unique ID. Now, I've already stored it in my .env file, and so the .env package is reading it in for me and putting it on process.env.notion database ID. So I don't need to configure that here live. Mostly, I just wanted to show you where to get it because it took me a little bit to figure that out. Okay, and by the way, if that's how your application says this is the database I'm interested in. Mm-hmm. On the other side of that, you would also need to, and again, this is where I would refer you to the Notion API documentation, but you will need to also go in and share your database with the integration that you are building. So that means you'd go into this ellipsis menu, and then there's like a whole list of connections here. You see how I have this one that says Notion Nylas APIs? Yeah. That's my integration for this specific case. So if you don't have a two-way connection, I have found that a lot of the error messages in the Notion API can be quite helpful. When you don't connect your database, yet you are trying to make calls from your script or from your application, their errors will actually mention that to you, which is quite nice. They'll say something to the effect of, maybe you forgot to share share your database with the integration. And every time I see that, I'm like, oh yeah, of course I did. I always do. So then you go in and share.
Cool.
Everything feeling good so far?
Yeah, totally.
Cool.
It's pretty much clearer.
All right. So why don't we talk through the code just a little bit? And again, I would call out that this sample, by and large, came from an author named Aman Gupta, who I believe works at Notion. And this is like this sample is largely based on an official example that they have baked into their Node.js SDK. So we're not going to talk through a lot of the code that they provide, as they do a great job of commenting it. I'm just really going to talk at a high level here about what's happening. So in our architecture, we talked about needing a database, not a Notion database, but a database for our application. So if I pull this back over here real quick, I mentioned earlier that we're going to need to store that history of changes in the database so that we have something to compare the latest to. So I also mentioned that in this case, just to keep things simple, we won't be like, standing up a real database. Instead, we're gonna put everything into like a plain old JavaScript object, and that's what this is the status map. So when we start this script or this application in Node.js, we're gonna be, there's a couple of calls here or a couple of functions that were created to just get that set up. So you're gonna pull in, once you run the script the first time, it's going to pull in data and populate it, populate that data and treat this object as a database. And so you can kind of see like that's what these first couple of calls would be. Again, there's a body in here that you can go have a look at and get into details on. It's basically just initial setup, making that first Notion API call, pull in the data, and then start tracking history.
Yeah, perfect.
And then next up down here, this is where all the kind of fun stuff happens for today. This find and send emails for updated tasks. So this here is going to be set basically on that polling mechanism. And I think the default for this example is set to like every, I don't know, I want to say 6 seconds maybe, or 3 seconds or something. I don't remember the number, but it's polling. So it's going to keep hitting that API, pulling down the latest and storing them and comparing for changes. So you'll see here, that's exactly what this does. It gets tasks from the Notion database. And then once you have all of those tasks, you're going to go through and kind of compare and find which ones are updated, if any. Okay, so if nothing's been updated, then you're done. That's all it is. And then you wait for the next poll and so on and so forth until there's been a change. Once there's been a change, again, just kind of coming back to our architecture for just a moment, recall that that's when we want to send an email, and we want to use the Nylas SDK to do that. So that's what we'll have a look at here. How do we actually do that? In this case, we have a function here that is set up. So the function's name is send update email with Nylas. And in this case, what we've done is take the data from the Notion API and specifically pull out the title of the card that has been changed and the status, like its new status. That's a choice of the application, but we could do pretty much anything because the Notion API gives you a ton of visibility into the specific objects that you might be interested in this case, cards in a Kanban board. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to prep by saying, okay, what do we want to say in the body of the email? And this is just a template, a JavaScript template string that says we're going to say in the body of the email, status of Notion task, put the title of the card, has been updated to, and put the new status.
Cool.
And then next up, we're going to draft an email and then send it. So if this is with the Nylas Node SDK, it's really, really simple to do. We just make a new draft. So it's a new instance of a draft. This draft here is coming from the Nylas SDK. We have a handful of models that you can use right there. So we pull that in and we instantiate a new draft. Pass in Nylas and then the Nylas client. And then from there, do all the things that you'd probably need to do even if you were writing an email by hand, right? Make a subject. Subject could be anything. This could be dynamic if you so choose. The body, so that's what this is right here. And then we're going to say who we're sending it to. Again, I put this in my .m file, but obviously you might store it in different places for a real application. In this case, we're going to send the email to devrel@nylas.com. So Blag, when I'm building this, you've probably seen a lot of different notifications coming in from Notion over the last few days. That's where this is.
That's right.
So the next up, all we got to do, we've made the draft, and now we're going to send the email. Basic try and catch in Node.js. So we're going to do a draft.send. Again, remember that this draft is an instance of the Nylas draft from the SDK. And then if that succeeds, then we have the message that was sent, and we'll just console log that out. We'll say the message with this subject was sent with this ID. And again, that ID is important because like that can, again, be used in turn for other things. That's your unique identifier for the email on the service provider itself. And of course, if things fail, and maybe they will, let's find out, but we'll have a console.error. Any questions about this code or anything that's going on here?
No, it's pretty clear. It's kind of different from what I'm used to, which is Python, Ruby, Java. But still, it's easy to understand.
Cool. All right. Well, welcome to my life, Blag. We like just 2 days ago, I had to watch you doing Prolog on the live stream. So, yeah, Node's definitely more my comfort spot. But for sure, I mean, keep in mind that any of the stuff that we're showing you here, you could do in Python, Ruby, Java, or PHP, any language you like. So as a final step here, let's just give this a run and see what happens, and hopefully good things happen. Let's find out. Do npm start. You can see that 6 pages were successfully fetched. Why 6 pages? Because there are 6 cards here in the Kanban board. That's what those pages they're referring to. And so, okay, you see the polling mechanism is starting to take place, right?
Yeah.
Nothing interesting happening. It says it's found 0 updated tasks every time. Now, let's say, for example, I'm like, all right, I don't know, maybe I'm Victor here, and I'm thinking desktop push notifications sounds like the next big thing I want to work on. So let's move that over to the next up column. So let's see what happens here. Aha. So you can see that now it's detected, the script has detected that something happened. And then on the next pass around, it sent that message, right? This is coming through that console log with the ID is this line right here. So if everything worked well, then what we're going to do is go over here and crack open the devrel@nylas.com inbox. Again, in this case, it's a Google group because this is a shared inbox, but it wouldn't have to be. It could just be my Gmail account or whatever. So you can see that just came through. And just like we saw in the JavaScript or in the Node.js script, the status of this Notion task, and then it dynamically put in the title, has been updated to next up. Maybe this alone is not super useful as an example, like as a real world sort of implementation. You'd probably want to put a link in there. trivial to do, because like Notion gives you all the information you would need to then pass that along to the Nylas SDK and ultimately send it as an email. Cool. So that's everything I wanted to show today. And I've been really excited about this one for a while. So hopefully it'll be useful to somebody. What do you think, Blag?
That was pretty cool. It was pretty awesome. And actually the email was sent like pretty fast. I mean, you moved the card over. I went to my inbox and the email was there. So
yeah, super fast. And, you know, doing it with Nylas ensures that since it's through a first-party connection, again, my user account, because I went through and as a user connected to that application via Nylas, like I can, you know, it ensures that those emails are actually going to get delivered. And yeah, it does happen fast. I think the way this script is written actually makes it probably waits for an extra round. So there's something to be said for, like, we'd probably even make that faster if we really wanted to optimize this particular script. Yeah. So let's talk a little about, just kind of as a final thought here, if you want to build on Notion, first up, developers.notion.com, and they've got just some really cool stuff going on there. It's an API I'm quite excited about and play around a lot with right now. And of course, for doing really cool stuff like this and more, developer.nylas.com, where you can imagine there's a lot of things you could do with email inside of Notion, but same with calendar, right? Like think, for example, Blag, like we have our whole sort of like content calendar for developer relations stored in Nylas. And there's probably some really cool things that we might want to consider building at some point. But all of that's stored in Notion, and you know, then we can take it and integrate with Nylas in interesting ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so use Notion a lot, so it would be cool to automate some things and get more notifications.
Yeah, totally. Who knows whether we'll do that or not, but if we do, we'll talk about it for sure. There's probably not a non-zero chance that we will, but we talk about a lot of really cool stuff, I think, on this live stream. And whether you're watching this on LinkedIn or on Twitter or anywhere else, all of these videos eventually find their way into YouTube. Our YouTube account is youtube.com/c/Nylas. And you can go in there and see like the whole history. This is our 30th episode. We started these a few months ago, so it's really gone by fast. But if you ever have any special requests, reach out. Blag here's been really quick to jump on some developer requests that we can turn around and do live streams for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just let us know via email or on Twitter. You can see all Twitter handles. And just let us know if you want to see something.
All right. Well, happy 30th, Blag, and thanks for following along with me with this little Notion script that I was really excited about. Appreciate it.
Thank you. It was really interesting.
Cool. See you next week. Bye, everybody.
Take care.